on Good Friday, as we enter the Easter weekend, the most hopeful and optimistic point on the Christian calendar. What is the state of the union tonight? Worried, pessimistic, and concerned that we are not heading in the right direction. The latest New York Times CBS News poll shows the number of people who think the U.S. is on the wrong track is at 70%, the highest it has been since the final days of George W. Bush's presidency. President Obama now gets low marks across the board. 57% disapprove of how he's handling the economy. 59% disapprove of how he's handling the deficit. 45% disapprove of how he's handling the situation in Libya. His overall job approval stands at 46% compared to 45% who disapprove. The president thinks he knows what's moving his numbers. The price at the pump. Last night at a fundraiser, the president said, "I'm confident because I travel around the country and my poll numbers go up and down depending on the latest crisis. And right now, gas prices are weighing heavily on people. But when I talk to ordinary folks, they are not paying attention. And we understand the world is complicated." If you don't understand the world is complicated, and if you exaggerate wildly, and if you're crazy, this is the way you talk about gas prices.
Look at what's going on with your gasoline prices. They're going to go to $5, $6, $7, and we don't have anybody in Washington that calls OPEC and says, fellas, it's time. It's over. You're not going to do it anymore.
If you don't understand the world is complicated, you don't know that you can create worldwide economic chaos by not raising the debt ceiling when necessary.
I say no to the debt ceiling. No to raising our debt ceiling. Now, some people will tell you, but Michelle, you don't want the government to shut down. The government won't shut down. This is what will happen. Revenue will continue to come into the United States Treasury, and we will first pay off our debts, our obligations, and interest on the debt. That's the first thing we'll do so we don't violate our credit rating.
If you don't understand the world is complicated, then 140 characters is more than enough to articulate all of your thinking about the United States' role in Libya. At Sarah Palin USA tweeted, "Get in, hit hard, get out. Need to send the world a message. We'll only intervene in anyone's business if we're dead serious." If you do understand the world is complicated, there is no one left in the Republican Party who speaks for you. Joining me now is Howard Fineman, senior political editor for the Huffington Post and an MSNBC political analyst, and Richard Wolff, MSNBC political analyst and an author of Renegade, The Making of a President. Thank you both for joining me tonight.
You bet. Hi, Lawrence.
Richard, did these poll numbers hit the White House by surprise? Did they understand there was a trend building with these kinds of negative numbers?
No, they've known this is building for a while. Gas prices haven't just suddenly spiked, but they also know that in spite of all the vulnerability they have on the economy, there's only one set of numbers that are actually worse than theirs. And that's what voters say they think about Republicans, and specifically about the Republican plans on things like the budget or on cutting taxes for the super wealthy. So, you know, when people talk about hope and change here, you know, yes, they're hoping gas prices come down and people feel better about the economy, but they also know the risk of change is what's going to drive people in this dynamic we're going to see over the next year or so.
Howard, the president does have some high disapproval numbers in there for a president running for re-election, but the Congress has a disapproval number of 75%. How do you think voters are balancing that out, their disapproval of the Congress and their disapproval of the job being done by the White House? Where does that leave them when it comes time to vote for president?
Well, it leaves them in a quandary, and it leaves them very upset that the Washington hasn't changed. It is true that the gas price numbers are hurting the president right now. It's true that there's a lot of uneasiness still about the economy. As a matter of fact, it's growing again. But I think it's also true that people are a little disappointed in the president because he hasn't been able to change the way Washington works at all. Indeed, Congress is even more poorly regarded. Everybody wanted a bigger deal than was done on the last budget go-round. And so in an odd way, the fact that the Republicans and Congress are so poorly regarded, that the whole system is so poorly regarded, drags everybody down, including the president. So on the one hand, it's true the Republicans are in even worse shape politically than the president. But on the other hand, it's true that every politician of any kind, including the President of the United States, is dragged down in this dismal mood that people have about the whole system.
Richard, I don't think we've seen a president who has faced a more simple-minded, nonsensical opposition as voiced by the Donald Trumps, the Michelle Bachmans.
Right.
This notion that, you don't have to raise the debt ceiling, spoken by a congresswoman who I'm not sure knew what the debt ceiling was when the year began. The Trump idiocy that just continues, he continues to spew nonstop when he's not talking about the birth certificate. When you look back at George W. Bush and the opposition he faced from the other side, it was issue-based opposition. It was an opposition to the wars of choice. It was opposition to specific things that the presidency was undertaking. How much of this giant fog of nonsense is dragging down the president's numbers?
Well, I think these two things are connected that we've just been talking about. The dissatisfaction with politicians across the board, the president, the Congress, everyone, is leading some voters, a sizable group, to reach out for the untested, the crazy, the extreme populist figures. That's why you end up with a Trump and a Bachmann coming up through the system. It's not just because we're fascinated with them in the media. It's because people are willing to try new things. And there's also partly the fallacy of Obama here, which is that he made it look easy. He made it look like you could come out of nothing and just ace it. As Krauthammer has argued, he was just a giant fluke. So why not have two flukes, right? Except that, of course, he didn't just ace it and didn't come out of nowhere. He was tested for 2 years. And he was tested extremely thoroughly on policy. That's how he stood out from someone like Hillary Clinton. So these two trends are connected. But, Democrats, when faced with this choice in 2004, chose the responsible guy. He may have been dull and flawed in his own way, but John Kerry was the respectable guy. I'm not sure Republicans are going to make the same choice this time around.
Howard, the president makes the point, obvious point, that the world is complicated, that really everything involving governing is complicated and difficult. And it seems like these poll numbers and the rise of Trump in the polls and the success of simple-minded messages that Republicans deliver, that seems to be successful with people who simply don't want the world to be complicated. They want to somehow get that complicated toothpaste back in the tube and live in some previously non-existent simple world that never existed.
Well, a couple things, Lawrence. One of them is that I know the president is frustrated about this. He believes that he has taken a thoughtful, nuanced approach to things. He would think of health care in that way. He would think of his work on the stimulus in that way. He's a guy who appreciates complexity, thinks he can describe it, but is frustrated personally, testy sometimes, about the failure of the media to understand it clearly in his view, and voters to understand it clearly in his view. So that's one of the things that the president is dealing with right now, and you see it pop out occasionally. The other thing that struck me in the CBS New York Times poll is that moderates are dropping, self-described moderates are dropping. This is related to the other things we were just talking about with Richard. There are more self-described liberals than there have been before, and overall, and more self-described conservatives. The moderates in the middle are shrinking as people look for absolutist answers to things. Simple answers, ideological answers. People are clinging to the verities they think they know because the world is almost too complicated for them to deal with, especially when it's not producing jobs and is producing $4.50 gasoline.
Richard, on jobs, in the New York Times CBS poll, the two interesting findings. One is that the number one issue that the respondents want the president to concentrate on is jobs. 21% say it should be jobs. The third one is the deficit. Deficit. Another item, only 29% say that deficit reduction would create jobs. So the Republican argument that deficit reduction would create jobs is believed by only 29%.
Which is the hardcore. Right.
Yes, and the deficit itself as an issue for the president comes in third. Has the White House made a mistake in adopting the Republican frame that the deficit is our number one issue?
Well, there are two things here. First of all, the longer they spend talking about debts and deficits, the more they are off topic, just as Republicans are. So, yes, that's why people are saying you're not dealing with the economy, you're not changing it, you're not talking about the things that we care about. And it's not like this is the first few months they've been talking about jobs. This has been a constant for the last couple of years. So people need to talk about jobs even as they deal with that deficit. But it's not Republican territory the way the deficit debate has been framed up, because as long as it's about raising taxes on people making $250,000 or more, that's great territory for Democrats, because more than 70% of voters agree with the Democratic position. As long as it's about changing Medicare in any kind of radical way, it's Democratic territory. So the deficit debate as it's played out has been good for Democrats, but deficits are still off the topic.
Howard Fineman of the Huffington Post and Richard Wolff, thank you both for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thanks, Lawrence.